Elena looked me dead in the eye across our kitchen table and said the four words that would change everything. I choose him, Marcus. Not sorry, not goodbye, not even an explanation. Just a declaration delivered with the same tone she used to order her morning latte. She stood there in her designer workout clothes, hair perfectly styled even though she claimed she'd just come from Pilates, and waited for me to fall apart. Most men would have lost it right there. Screaming, pleading, maybe throwing something across the room. But I just nodded, took a slow sip of my coffee and said two words that clearly weren't what she expected. I understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Chen, and at 38, I thought I had built the kind of life that other men envied. Senior architect at one of Seattle's most prestigious firms, a craftsman-style home in Queen Anne, with views of the Sound, and a wife who could stop traffic just by walking into a room. Elena and I had been married for 8 years, and from the outside we looked like we had everything figured out. Designer furniture, weekend trips to Napa, dinner parties where we played the role of the successful power couple to perfection. I was the guy who wore custom suits to client meetings, drove a Tesla Model S that I'd actually earned, and had a portfolio of buildings across the Pacific Northwest that bore my signature. Reliable, successful, the kind of man who could draft blueprints for million-dollar homes before noon and still make it to the gym before dark. For years I believed the life we were living together was real, built on something solid, something that would last. But here's what I learned about beautiful facades. They can hide structural damage that runs so deep, the whole thing collapses before you even realize the foundation was cracked. I just never thought to look behind the carefully curated Instagram posts and charity gala photos to see what was really holding us together. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to this moment in our kitchen. But back then, I was too busy building other people's dreams to notice my own was quietly falling apart. Elena wasn't just beautiful, she was the kind of woman who could walk into a conference room full of investors and make them forget why they were there. Auburn hair that caught light like it was professionally lit, green eyes that seemed to see right through people, and a smile that could sell anything to anyone. She worked in marketing for a tech startup downtown, one of those companies that promised to revolutionize something that didn't really need revolutionizing, but somehow managed to attract millions in funding anyway. We met at a networking event in Pioneer Square 7 years ago. I was there representing my firm for some urban development project, and she was there selling her company's latest app to anyone who would listen. While other men stumbled over themselves trying to get her attention, I just walked up and asked her about the architecture of the building we were standing in. She seemed surprised that someone wanted to talk about something other than her. That conversation stretched into dinner, dinner became weekend trips, and weekend trips became a wedding that made the society pages. Our house sat on a hill overlooking Elliott Bay, a 1920s craftsman that I'd spent 2 years meticulously renovating. Original hardwood floors refinished to perfection, a kitchen with marble countertops that Elena had insisted on, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the water like living paintings. Every morning I'd stand on our deck with my coffee, watching ferries cross the Sound, thinking about how lucky I was to wake up in a place that beautiful with a woman that stunning. The routine we'd built felt comfortable, even romantic. Elena would leave for her downtown office in her BMW, always dressed like she was heading to a magazine shoot rather than a marketing meeting. I'd head to my studio in Fremont, where I'd spend my days turning ideas into structures that would outlast both of us. Evenings were wine bars in Capitol Hill, gallery openings in Belltown, or quiet nights at home, where we'd cook together and pretend we were still newlyweds discovering each other. But comfort, I learned, isn't the same thing as connection, and routine isn't the same thing as intimacy. We were two people living parallel lives in the same beautiful house, and somewhere along the way, we'd stopped actually seeing each other. We just got really good at playing the roles we thought we were supposed to play. The changes started small, so subtle that I convinced myself they were just natural evolution. Elena began working later, claiming her startup was in a crucial growth phase that required her complete attention. She'd come home after 9, sometimes after 10, with stories about late meetings and client dinners that always seemed to involve the same group of colleagues I'd never met. Her phone, once casually left on kitchen counters, now went everywhere with her, even to the bathroom. She developed new interests almost overnight. Suddenly she was passionate about rock climbing, something she'd never mentioned in 7 years together. She joined a gym in South Lake Union, a trendy place with exposed brick walls and equipment that looked more like modern art than exercise machines. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4, she'd disappear for hours, returning home with that post-workout glow and stories about her climbing instructor that seemed unusually detailed. Her wardrobe shifted too. The elegant dresses and conservative blazers gave way to athletic wear that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Lululemon leggings, Patagonia jackets, climbing shoes that she displayed on our mudroom shelf like trophies. She started talking about outdoor adventures, weekend climbing trips to the Cascades, and something called bouldering that apparently required special chalk and an entirely new vocabulary. When I asked if she wanted company on these adventures, she'd laugh and say I was too busy with my projects, that she didn't want to burden me with her new hobby. She was probably right. I was deep into designing a residential complex in Bellevue, one of those projects that could either make or break a career. But looking back, I wonder if she was protecting her new interest from my presence, or protecting me from seeing what her new interest really was. The climbing instructor's name was Derek. Elena mentioned him casually at first, just another part of her gym stories. Derek said this about proper form. Derek recommended that route for beginners. Derek thought she had natural talent for the sport. Gradually, Derek became a constant presence in her conversations, the expert opinion she quoted on everything, from equipment to technique, to philosophy about conquering fear. I started paying attention to how her voice changed when she talked about him. There was an energy there, an excitement that I hadn't heard when she talked about anything else in months. She'd describe his teaching methods with the kind of detail usually reserved for people you found genuinely fascinating. Derek wasn't just her instructor. He was becoming her reference point, the person whose opinions mattered, whose approval she sought. When she'd return from her climbing sessions, she'd be animated in a way that reminded me of how she used to be when we first met. Bright-eyed, full of stories, eager to share experiences. Except now, all those experiences centered around a person who wasn't me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I told myself it was healthy for her to have interests outside our marriage, that passion for anything was better than the quiet resignation that had been settling over our relationship. But deep down I knew I was watching my wife fall for someone else in real time, one climbing lesson at a time. The late nights became a pattern, but the explanations became more elaborate. Elena would text me around 5 in the evening, always with some variation of the same story. Last-minute client crisis, emergency strategy session, team dinner that couldn't be rescheduled. She'd come home after midnight, sliding into bed with apologies whispered in the dark about the demanding nature of startup culture. Her company was apparently always in crisis mode, always on the verge of some breakthrough that required everyone to work ridiculous hours. I knew enough about business to understand that startups could be unpredictable, but Elena's schedule seemed to defy logic. Marketing emergencies at 10 p.m., brainstorming sessions that stretched past midnight, weekend work retreats that I was never invited to hear about until they were over. She'd show me the photos sometimes, proof of her professional dedication. Conference rooms with whiteboards covered in strategic diagrams, team dinners at restaurants I recognized but had never been to with her, group shots of colleagues who all looked young and energetic and completely absorbed in whatever they were building together. Elena would point out various team members rattling off their roles and contributions, but I noticed she never talked about specific projects or actual work accomplishments. The photos felt staged somehow, like evidence carefully curated to support a story rather than natural documentation of professional life. Everyone looked too polished, too happy, too much like they were performing the idea of a successful team rather than actually being one. But I pushed down my suspicions, telling myself that paranoia was just another form of selfishness, that a supportive husband should trust his wife's career commitments. What really started bothering me was how refreshed she looked after these supposed marathon work sessions. She'd come home claiming exhaustion from 14-hour days, but her makeup would still be perfect, her hair would still have that salon-fresh bounce, and she'd smell like expensive perfume rather than office coffee and stress. When I worked late on complex projects, I looked like I'd been wrestling with blueprints for hours. Elena looked like she'd been at a spa. The weekend climbing trips started in early spring. Elena would pack a small duffel bag with her expensive gear and disappear for entire Saturdays, sometimes Sundays too. The destinations were always somewhere in the Cascades, places with names like Rattlesnake Ridge or Little Says, spots that were supposedly perfect for developing her technique before tackling more challenging routes. She'd leave early, around 6 in the morning, claiming that serious climbers got the best routes before crowds arrived. She'd return late, sometimes after dark, with stories about perfect weather conditions and breakthrough moments in her climbing progress. Her gear would be appropriately dusty, her climbing shoes would have the right kind of wear patterns, and she'd show me photos of scenic overlooks that proved she'd been exactly where she claimed to be. But something felt rehearsed about these adventure reports. She'd describe the physical challenges in detail, the mental aspects of overcoming fear, the camaraderie among climbers who shared difficult routes. Yet she never seemed tired the way you'd expect from someone who'd spent 8 hours scaling rock faces. If anything, she seemed energized, glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from doing something you love with someone you care about. I started looking at her climbing photos more carefully. Elena posed against mountain backdrops, smiling with the kind of genuine happiness I hadn't seen from her in months. The selfies showed her looking confident and strong, but I noticed they were always taken from angles that would be impossible if she were alone. Someone else was behind the camera, someone who knew how to capture her best expressions, someone who cared enough to take multiple shots until they got the perfect one. When I asked about her climbing partners, Elena would mention a rotating group of enthusiasts from her gym, people who shared rides to save on gas and paired up for safety reasons. Names would come and go in her stories, but Derek's name appeared there every single adventure, always as the experienced guide who kept everyone safe. The instructor pushed her to attempt routes just beyond her comfort zone. The truth was hiding in plain sight, documented in photos where shadows suggested 2 people instead of groups, in climbing shots that required a photographer who clearly knew Elena's best angles, in the way she talked about conquering fears while looking more alive than she had in our entire marriage. She wasn't just learning to climb rocks, she was learning to fall for someone else, one scenic overlook at a time. Derek Williams was 32, 6'3", and looked like he'd been carved from the same granite he taught people to climb. I saw him for the first time at Elena's gym when I decided to surprise her with lunch on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd been talking about her breakthrough with some advanced technique, and I thought it might be nice to celebrate her progress, maybe meet some of the people who'd become such a big part of her life. The gym was everything Elena had described: exposed brick walls lined with artificial rock formations, climbing holds scattered in patterns that looked like abstract art, and the kind of industrial lighting that made everyone look like they were auditioning for an outdoor gear commercial. The clientele was exactly what you'd expect from South Lake Union. Young tech workers in expensive athletic wear, professionals who treated fitness like another form of networking, people who looked like they'd never encountered actual dirt but wore gear designed for Everest expeditions. Derek stood out immediately, not just because of his size but because of his presence. While everyone else looked like they were trying to appear outdoorsy, Derek actually was outdoorsy. Sun-weathered skin that spoke of real mountain time, forearms that belonged to someone who'd spent years gripping actual rock rather than artificial holds, and an easy confidence that drew attention without demanding it. He moved through the gym like he owned it, offering advice and encouragement with the kind of natural authority that made people listen. He was everything I wasn't. Where I was calculated and precise, Derek was instinctive and flowing. Where I built things to last, Derek lived in the moment. Where I wore suits and thought about long-term planning, Derek wore chalk-stained shorts and seemed to exist entirely in the present tense. Watching him demonstrate technique, I understood why Elena had become so passionate about climbing. Derek didn't just teach movement, he taught people to trust themselves, to push beyond their perceived limitations, to find strength they didn't know they had. When I introduced myself as Elena's husband, Derek's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to holding his own weight against gravity, looked me directly in the eye, and said he'd heard wonderful things about me. The words were perfectly appropriate, but the way he said them felt like he was acknowledging a competitor rather than meeting a spouse. Elena appeared from the changing room looking flustered, not quite able to hide her surprise at seeing me there. She rushed through introductions, praising Derek's instruction while emphasizing the group dynamic of her climbing community. But I watched the way they stood near each other, the unconscious mirroring of their body language, the split second of eye contact that lasted just a moment too long before she remembered I was watching. Derek mentioned how quickly Elena was progressing, how natural she was at reading routes and solving movement problems. He talked about her potential for more advanced climbing, outdoor excursions that would really challenge her abilities. Elena listened with the kind of focused attention she once gave to my architectural projects, hanging on every word like he was revealing secrets of the universe rather than discussing recreational athletics. Standing there in that gym, watching my wife absorb praise from a man who clearly saw something in her that he wanted to cultivate, I realized that Derek wasn't just her climbing instructor. He was becoming her inspiration, her motivation, the person whose approval had started to matter more than mine. And Elena wasn't just learning to climb, she was learning to see herself through his eyes, to value the qualities he admired, to become the version of herself that he found most compelling. The lunch I'd brought sat forgotten in the bag while Derek demonstrated some technique Elena had been working on. I watched him position her hands on the holds, adjust her stance with touches that lingered just a moment longer than instruction required, guide her through movements that brought their bodies closer together than climbing actually demanded. They moved like dance partners who'd been practicing together for years, like two people who'd found a rhythm that belonged entirely to them. That afternoon in the gym, watching Elena laugh at Derek's jokes and glow under his attention, I understood that I was witnessing something that had already progressed far beyond professional instruction. I was seeing the moment when emotional affair crossed into something more deliberate, more dangerous, more real. Derek wasn't just teaching my wife to climb, he was teaching her to want something different, something that looked a lot like him. I started tracking the little details, not because I wanted to build a case, but because I needed to understand what I was really dealing with. Elena's climbing gear, once neatly organized in our mudroom, began showing signs of more use than weekend adventures could account for. Her shoes developed wear patterns that suggested daily use rather than occasional hobby time. Her chalk bag, initially pristine white, became stained and worn like equipment that saw constant action. The receipts told their own story. Elena had always been careful with money, practical about purchases, someone who researched everything before buying, but her climbing expenses began escalating in ways that didn't match her described skill level. Professional-grade harnesses that cost more than most people's monthly gym memberships, specialized shoes for different types of rock, technical gear that seemed designed for serious mountaineering rather than beginner bouldering. She bought a membership to a second climbing gym, this one in Ballard, claiming it offered different route challenges that would help her develop more diverse skills. When I looked it up online, the Ballard gym specialized in advanced techniques, outdoor preparation, and training programs for people planning major climbing expeditions. It wasn't the kind of place someone went to continue casual weekend hobby climbing. It was where serious climbers prepared for serious challenges. Her phone patterns changed in ways that would have been invisible to someone not paying attention. Elena had always been attached to her device, but now it became an extension of her body. She'd check messages while we were having dinner, step away to take calls that she claimed were work-related, spend long minutes typing responses to texts that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen in months. The really telling detail was how she'd positioned her phone when she set it down. Elena had always been careless about privacy, leaving her device face up on tables, never bothering to angle screens away from me when she was scrolling through social media or responding to messages. But now her phone was always face down, always positioned so I couldn't accidentally see notifications, always locked with a passcode she'd recently changed without mentioning it. Most revealing of all was her driving patterns. Elena's car had a GPS system that tracked recent destinations, and during one of my careful observations, I noticed addresses that didn't match any of her explained activities. The climbing gym in Ballard was there, but so was a coffee shop in Fremont that she'd never mentioned, a park near Green Lake that wasn't on any climbing routes, and several residential addresses in neighborhoods where she claimed to have no friends or business. One address appeared repeatedly, more than her actual workplace, more than either of the gyms she claimed to frequent. It was a craftsman-style house in Wallingford, modest but well-maintained, the kind of place where a climbing instructor who spent his money on gear and adventures rather than mortgage payments might choose to live. When I drove by one evening, Elena's BMW was parked in the driveway next to a rugged Subaru Outback covered in national park stickers. The detective work felt beneath me, like I was reducing myself to someone I didn't want to be. But knowledge is power, and I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting before I decided how to fight it. Every receipt, every GPS entry, every wear pattern on climbing gear was a piece of evidence that Elena's new life wasn't just about discovering outdoor adventure. It was about discovering Derek, one carefully concealed meeting at a time. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't the explosive argument I'd been dreading. Elena didn't storm into the house demanding a divorce or throw accusations about my shortcomings as a husband. Instead, she chose a quiet Sunday morning, when we were both drinking coffee in our kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows I'd carefully positioned to capture the best views of Elliott Bay. She'd been unusually quiet for several days, not avoiding conversation but not initiating it either. I could feel something building, some decision she was working toward, but I didn't push. Experience had taught me that Elena processed major choices internally before announcing them, and pushing for premature discussion usually made things worse rather than better. That morning, she looked rested and resolved, like someone who'd finally found clarity after weeks of internal debate. She was wearing one of those expensive athletic outfits that had become her uniform, clothes that managed to look casual and sophisticated at the same time, as if she might spontaneously decide to climb a mountain or attend a board meeting. Her hair was styled in the effortless way that actually required significant effort, and she wore just enough makeup to look natural while appearing better than natural. Elena set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, looked directly at me with those green eyes that had first captured my attention at that networking event 7 years earlier, and spoke with the kind of calm certainty that left no room for argument or negotiation. She didn't apologize or explain or offer justifications. She simply stated her decision, like she was announcing her choice of restaurant for dinner. "I choose him, Marcus." 4 words that carried the weight of 8 years of marriage, 2 words that reduced our entire relationship to a decision between options, a choice between 2 different versions of her future. Not "I'm leaving you" or "I want a divorce" or "I've fallen for someone else." Just "I choose him," as if love were a multiple-choice question, and she'd finally selected her and she waited for my response, clearly expecting some kind of emotional explosion. Her posture was braced but confident, like someone who'd prepared for a difficult conversation but felt certain about her position. Elena had always been someone who commanded rooms, who expected her decisions to be respected even when they weren't popular, and this moment was no different. She'd made her choice, announced it with characteristic directness, and now expected me to react in whatever way I needed to react. But I surprised her. Instead of anger or heartbreak, or desperate attempts at negotiation, I just nodded and said 2 words that clearly weren't part of her script. "I understand." Because the truth was I did understand. Elena hadn't just chosen Derek over me, she'd chosen adventure over security, passion over comfort, the unknown over the predictable. She'd chosen someone who made her feel alive over someone who made her feel safe. Silence that followed stretched longer than either of us expected. Elena blinked, shifted in her chair, and for the first time in months, looked uncertain. She'd been prepared for tears, arguments, maybe even threats. She hadn't been prepared for acceptance. My calm response seemed to knock her off balance, like she'd been bracing against a door that suddenly opened, leaving her stumbling forward into space she hadn't expected to exist. In that moment, watching Elena struggle to process my reaction, I realized something that would define everything that came next. She didn't just want to leave me for Derek, she wanted me to fight for her, to prove that I cared enough to be devastated by her departure. She wanted drama, emotion, evidence that our 8 years together had meant something significant enough to destroy. Instead, she got understanding, acceptance, and a husband who seemed almost relieved to finally have clarity about where we stood. What Elena didn't know, what made me smile internally even as I maintained my composed exterior, was that I'd been 3 steps ahead of this conversation for weeks. While she thought she was making a shocking announcement, I'd been quietly preparing for this exact moment. Derek Williams might have taught her to climb, but I was about to teach both of them about consequences. Because sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal isn't anger or heartbreak. Sometimes it's simply letting people discover what they've actually chosen, one uncomfortable truth at a time. The days following Elena's declaration settled into an unusual rhythm. She moved through our house like someone who'd already mentally relocated, packing belongings with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this transition for weeks. Expensive climbing gear disappeared first, then her favorite clothes, then personal items that had been scattered throughout our shared spaces for years. She worked methodically, room by room, erasing evidence of her presence with surgical precision. What struck me most wasn't the packing itself, but how organized it seemed. Elena had always been someone who made decisions impulsively, who thrived on spontaneity and changed plans at the last minute. But this departure was choreographed, planned, executed with the kind of forethought that suggested she'd been mentally rehearsing this moment for months. Every box was labeled, every item had been considered, every step seemed designed to minimize disruption while maximizing efficiency. She'd rented a storage unit in Ballard, she explained when I asked about logistics, just temporary, until she figured out more permanent arrangements. She spoke about her future in vague terms, references to new opportunities and fresh starts that never included specific details about where she'd be living or how she'd be supporting herself. When I offered to help with the practical aspects of separation, division of assets, mortgage responsibilities, she waved away my concerns with an airy confidence that everything would work itself out. Derek, she mentioned casually, had connections in the outdoor industry, people who could help her transition her marketing skills into something more aligned with her passions. She talked about potential opportunities with gear companies, adventure travel outfits, organizations that promoted outdoor lifestyle brands. It all sounded very exciting and very uncertain, the kind of career pivot that required either significant savings or someone willing to provide financial support during the transition period. I listened to these plans with the same careful attention I gave to client presentations, noting details, asking clarifying questions, maintaining the professional demeanor that seemed to frustrate Elena more than emotional outbursts would have. She clearly expected me to be more affected by her departure, more concerned about the practical implications of her decisions, more invested in talking her out of whatever future she was constructing with Derek. Instead, I treated her exit strategy like a project timeline, offering practical suggestions and identifying potential complications with the same analytical approach I used for architectural challenges. When she mentioned needing time to figure out financial arrangements, I suggested she speak with our accountant about separating joint accounts. When she talked about storage solutions, I recommended facilities with better security than the place she'd chosen. When she discussed career transitions, I offered to make introductions to marketing professionals in the outdoor industry. My helpful efficiency seemed to unnerve her more than anger would have. Elena kept pausing in her packing, studying my face as if she were trying to decode some hidden emotional response. She'd clearly prepared for various scenarios, from devastation to rage to desperate attempts at reconciliation. She hadn't prepared for a husband who treated her betrayal like a business transaction requiring orderly resolution, but beneath my calm exterior, I was conducting my own systematic analysis of what Elena thought she was gaining and what she didn't realize she was losing. Derek might have taught her to climb rocks, but I was about to teach her about the difference between fantasy and reality when it came to building an actual life with someone. Derek Williams lived in a craftsman house in Wallingford that looked charming from the outside and probably felt romantic during brief visits. But I knew enough about real estate to recognize the difference between surface appeal and structural integrity, between spaces designed for adventure fantasies and homes built for actual living. Elena was about to discover that difference firsthand. The house itself was typical for the neighborhood, built in the 1920s with the kind of period details that looked great in photos but required constant maintenance in reality. Original hardwood floors that showed every scuff, single-pane windows that leaked heat in winter, electrical systems that belonged in a museum rather than a modern home. The kind of place that charmed visitors during short stays but revealed its limitations to anyone who tried to live there full-time. Derek had decorated with the aesthetic priorities of someone who spent money on experiences rather than comfort. Climbing gear dominated every room, not just stored efficiently, but displayed like art installations. Ropes coiled on wall mounts, carabiners hanging from hooks like Christmas ornaments, photographs of mountain expeditions covering surfaces where most people kept family pictures or decorative objects. The furniture looked assembled from whatever was available and affordable rather than chosen with any consideration for coordinated comfort. The kitchen was particularly telling. Minimal counter space, appliances that belonged in a college dormitory, storage solutions that prioritized climbing equipment over cooking tools. This was the kitchen of someone who survived on protein bars and takeout, who viewed food preparation as an inconvenience that interrupted more interesting activities. Elena, who'd grown accustomed to our gourmet kitchen with its marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, was about to discover the reality of romance without domestic infrastructure. But the most revealing aspect of Derek's living situation wasn't what the house contained. It was what it didn't contain. No guest bedroom for visitors, no home office for professional work, no space designed for anyone other than Derek himself. This was a bachelor's retreat, optimized for one person's lifestyle, not a home designed to accommodate partnership or shared domestic life. Elena was moving from a house designed for two successful adults to a space that had never seriously considered the possibility of permanent cohabitation. Derek's financial situation was something Elena had never bothered to investigate, probably because she'd never needed to think practically about money during our marriage. But climbing instruction, even at Seattle's most expensive gyms, wasn't exactly a lucrative career path. Derek supplemented his income with outdoor guide work, leading weekend expeditions and teaching wilderness skills to corporate teams, but that income was seasonal, weather-dependent, and required constant physical presence. He lived paycheck to paycheck, spending money on gear and travel rather than savings or investments. His idea of financial planning was making sure he had enough cash for the next climbing trip, not building equity or preparing for future security. The Subaru in his driveway wasn't a fashion statement, it was transportation carefully chosen for function over form, reliability over comfort, utility over status. Elena had grown accustomed to a certain standard of living during our marriage, not ostentatious wealth, but the kind of comfortable prosperity that made daily life smooth and pleasant. She'd never worried about mortgage payments, never questioned whether we could afford a weekend getaway, never calculated whether dinner at a nice restaurant would strain our budget. She spent money on climbing gear without considering cost because she'd never had to consider cost. Derek's world operated on completely different financial principles. Every purchase required consideration, every expense had to be weighed against available resources, every decision involved trade-offs between competing priorities. The climbing gear Elena had been accumulating with casual abundance represented significant investments for someone earning Derek's income. The weekend trips to mountain destinations weren't casual adventures but carefully budgeted expeditions that required advanced planning and cost calculation. Most significantly, Derek's lifestyle left no room for supporting someone else's transition period. He wasn't positioned to provide financial stability while Elena figured out her career pivot, wasn't able to maintain the standard of living she'd grown accustomed to, wasn't prepared to subsidize someone else's discovery of their authentic self. Elena was about to learn that passion and financial security weren't the same thing, that choosing adventure over stability meant accepting the limitations that came with that choice. I knew all this because I'd done my research. Not through detective work or invasion of privacy, but through the kind of careful observation that came naturally to someone who made a living analyzing structural integrity. While Elena was falling for Derek's charm and competence, I was noticing the details that romance tends to overlook. The climbing community Elena had embraced with such enthusiasm was smaller and more interconnected than she realized. Serious climbers in Seattle knew each other, shared information about routes and conditions, gossiped about relationships and drama with the intensity of any tight-knit social group. Elena thought she was joining a community of outdoor enthusiasts. She was actually entering a world where everyone knew everyone else's business, where her affair with a married woman wouldn't stay secret for long. Derek's reputation in that community was more complex than Elena understood. He was skilled and knowledgeable, respected for his technical abilities and safety consciousness. But he was also known for his pattern of becoming romantically involved with his students, particularly attractive women who were new to climbing and impressed by his expertise. Elena wasn't Derek's first married student to develop feelings that extended beyond rope technique. The climbing community had watched this dynamic play out before. They'd seen Derek's intense attention to promising female students, watched relationships develop that started with extra instruction time and progressed to private coaching sessions. They'd observed the pattern of married women discovering their adventurous selves through Derek's guidance, leaving stable relationships for the excitement of outdoor romance, only to discover that Derek's interest tended to wane once the challenge of conquest was complete. Elena thought she was special, thought her connection with Derek was unique and profound. The climbing community saw her as Derek's latest project, another suburban wife who'd confused athletic instruction with emotional intimacy. They were polite to her face, welcoming her to group climbs and social gatherings, but behind her back they were taking bets on how long this particular romance would last. The really cruel irony was that Elena's enthusiasm for climbing, which she attributed to Derek's inspiration, was actually making her less attractive to him over time. Derek was drawn to the challenge of introducing newcomers to his world, the satisfaction of being someone's gateway to adventure and self-discovery. But once students became competent climbers, once they no longer needed his guidance and protection, his interest shifted to the next promising beginner. Elena had progressed rapidly, driven by her desire to impress Derek and prove her commitment to their shared passion. But every milestone she achieved, every route she mastered independently, every moment of competence she demonstrated was actually reducing her appeal to someone who defined himself through being needed, being the expert, being the one who opened doors to experiences others couldn't access on their own. The more skilled Elena became at climbing, the less special she became to Derek. And the climbing community, which had seen this progression many times before, was quietly waiting for Derek to lose interest and start scouting for his next student to inspire. Elena's plan for transitioning her marketing career into the outdoor industry revealed how little she understood about either field. She'd been successful in tech marketing because she understood that ecosystem, knew the key players, could speak the language that resonated with her target audiences. But outdoor industry marketing operated on completely different principles, required different relationships, demanded credibility that came from genuine involvement rather than recent enthusiasm. The companies Elena hoped to work with were small, tightly knit organizations where everyone knew everyone else's background and qualifications. They weren't impressed by tech industry success or generic marketing skills. They wanted people who'd lived the outdoor lifestyle for years, who understood gear and conditions from personal experience, who could represent brands authentically because they were genuine customers first and marketers second. Elena's resume looked impressive on paper, but it screamed outsider to anyone familiar with outdoor industry culture. Her climbing experience measured in months rather than years, her gear knowledge limited to whatever Derek had recommended, her understanding of outdoor culture shaped entirely by her relationship with one instructor rather than organic involvement in the community. She was essentially asking companies to hire her based on a hobby she'd recently adopted and a passion she'd discovered through romantic attraction. The networking contacts Derek had promised turned out to be casual acquaintances rather than professional connections. Derek knew people throughout the climbing community, but those relationships were social rather than business-oriented. He could introduce Elena to fellow climbers and outdoor enthusiasts, but he couldn't provide access to decision-makers at companies that might hire marketing professionals. Most of the serious outdoor industry professionals Derek knew were people who'd built their careers through decades of involvement, who'd earned their positions through demonstrated expertise and long-term commitment to the lifestyle. They were friendly enough to Derek socially, but they weren't positioned to create job opportunities for his latest girlfriend, especially one whose qualifications consisted primarily of recent enthusiasm and ambitious career change goals. Elena had assumed that passion and determination would be enough to open doors in an industry she found appealing. She was about to discover that career transitions required more than good intentions and romantic inspiration, that professional credibility couldn't be borrowed from personal relationships, that wanting something badly wasn't the same as being qualified to achieve it. The most significant oversight in Elena's planning was her complete lack of understanding about Derek's long-term goals and intentions. She'd constructed an elaborate fantasy about their future together, imagining shared adventures and parallel career developments without ever seriously investigating whether Derek shared those visions or was simply enjoying a pleasant present without thinking about permanent future arrangements. Derek's lifestyle was designed around freedom and flexibility, around being able to pursue opportunities as they arose without being constrained by domestic responsibilities or long-term commitments. He'd structured his life to minimize obligations, to maintain options, to preserve the ability to travel and explore without having to consider someone else's needs or preferences. Elena represented a complication to that carefully maintained independence. The climbing trips Elena had been joining were Derek's personal adventures that he'd been generous enough to share, not collaborative expeditions planned with her involvement in mind. The gear recommendations he'd provided were suggestions for improving her individual skills, not investments in their shared future. The career advice he'd offered was casual encouragement rather than serious professional guidance. Elena had interpreted Derek's attention and instruction as signs of deepening commitment, evidence that he was as invested in building something permanent as she was. But Derek had simply been doing what he always did, sharing his expertise with someone eager to learn, enjoying the company of an attractive woman who admired his abilities, living in the present without making promises about the future. The climbing community understood Derek's patterns well enough to recognize that Elena was mistaking instruction for courtship, confusing athletic mentorship with romantic partnership. They'd watched other women make similar assumptions, seen relationships develop from similar dynamics, observed the disappointment that inevitably followed when Derek's students discovered that sharing adventures wasn't the same as sharing life goals. Elena thought she was moving toward a future with someone who understood her authentic self and supported her personal growth. Derek thought he was enjoying a pleasant relationship with someone who shared his current interests. Neither had bothered to clarify their actual expectations or intentions, which meant both were heading toward discoveries that would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. The storage unit Elena had rented in Ballard became the physical symbol of her transition period, the temporary space where she'd placed belongings that didn't fit into Derek's bachelor lifestyle. She described it as a brief necessity, a convenient solution while she and Derek figured out more permanent living arrangements. But storage units have a way of becoming permanent when people don't want to confront the reality that their belongings don't have anywhere else to go. Elena's furniture, the pieces she'd carefully selected for our Queen Anne house, looked ridiculous in Derek's craftsman cottage. Her dining room table, designed for entertaining dinner parties, couldn't fit through Derek's front door. Her decorative objects, chosen to complement our sophisticated aesthetic, looked pretentious and out of place among Derek's climbing gear and outdoor equipment. Her books, collected over years of professional development and personal interest, had nowhere to live in a house where every shelf was occupied by technical manuals and adventure narration. Most telling of all, Elena's clothes revealed the complete disconnect between her former life and her new reality. The professional wardrobe she'd built for tech industry success had no relevance to Derek's world. The designer pieces she'd accumulated for social events and dinner parties were completely inappropriate for the outdoor lifestyle she was trying to embrace. Even her casual clothes, carefully curated for looking effortlessly stylish, were wrong for someone who was supposed to be prioritizing function over fashion. Elena found herself shopping constantly, trying to acquire gear and clothing that would help her fit into Derek's world while storing the evidence of her previous identity in that Ballard storage unit. She was essentially paying monthly fees to house the parts of herself that didn't work in her new life, creating a physical monument to the disconnect between who she'd been and who she was trying to become. The storage unit represented more than temporary inconvenience. It was proof that Elena hadn't actually integrated into Derek's life so much as she'd temporarily abandoned her own. She was living in the margins of someone else's world, occupying space that had been grudgingly made available rather than enthusiastically shared. Her belongings were homeless because she'd never actually found a home with Derek, just temporary accommodation in someone else's space. Every monthly payment for that storage unit was a reminder that Elena was maintaining two lives, one stored away in Ballard and one precariously constructed in Wallingford. The practical reality of her situation was becoming impossible to ignore, even if the romantic fantasy was still providing enough emotional satisfaction to delay serious consideration of long-term sustainability. The social dynamics Elena encountered in Derek's world were more complex and less welcoming than she'd anticipated. The climbing community that had seemed so friendly and inclusive during her initial visits revealed itself to be highly stratified, with hierarchies based on experience, skill level, and authenticity that Elena was only beginning to understand. Serious climbers, the ones who'd been living this lifestyle for years, were polite to Elena but clearly viewed her as Derek's temporary distraction rather than a genuine member of their community. They included her in group activities when Derek was present but didn't extend independent invitations or treat her as someone worth knowing for her own qualities rather than her association with their friend. The women in Derek's social circle were particularly challenging for Elena to navigate. Many of them were Derek's former students or romantic interests, women who'd followed similar paths from suburban stability into outdoor adventure. They understood Elena's trajectory because they'd lived variations of it themselves, which made them both sympathetic and judgmental in ways that Elena found unsettling. These women had made choices similar to Elena's, but they'd had more time to experience the consequences of those choices. Some had successfully built new lives around outdoor culture, finding careers and relationships that sustained their passion for adventure. Others had discovered that romantic inspiration wasn't enough to support fundamental life changes, that passion without practical foundation led to disappointment and regret. Elena found herself being evaluated against the experiences of women who'd preceded her in Derek's attention, measured against previous girlfriends who'd attempted similar transitions with varying degrees of success. The community wasn't cruel to her, but they weren't particularly invested in her success either. They'd seen this story before, knew how it usually ended, and were maintaining polite distance while waiting for Elena to discover what they already knew about Derek's patterns and limitations. The most uncomfortable dynamic was Elena's growing awareness that she was being discussed when she wasn't present, that her relationship with Derek was a source of entertainment and speculation for people who had little else to occupy their attention. Her affair, her departure from marriage, her ambitious career plans were all subjects of casual conversation among people who viewed other people's drama as recreational diversion. Elena had expected to find acceptance and community among Derek's friends. Instead, she found herself performing for an audience that was more interested in watching her story unfold than supporting her success, more curious about whether she'd prove their assumptions correct than hopeful that she'd surprise them with unexpected resilience. The financial pressure Elena hadn't anticipated began manifesting in small but significant ways. Derek's lifestyle operated on assumptions about shared expenses that Elena hadn't considered during her romantic planning phase. Climbing trips that had seemed like generous gifts when she was married and financially secure became costly obligations when she was responsible for her own contributions to gas, food, equipment, and accommodation. Derek expected financial partnership rather than financial support, assumed that Elena's marketing career provided income comparable to his instruction earnings, didn't realize that her transition period meant dramatically reduced earning capacity. He suggested restaurants and activities based on his own budget calculations, not recognizing that Elena's financial situation had changed fundamentally since leaving her marriage. Elena found herself spending her savings to maintain the lifestyle she'd adopted during her affair, using money she'd accumulated during years of dual income stability to subsidize adventures with someone who couldn't reciprocate that financial contribution. Every climbing trip, every dinner out, every piece of gear she purchased to keep up with Derek's expectations was reducing her financial security while increasing her dependence on a relationship that was providing less practical support than she'd anticipated. The career transition Elena had planned so optimistically was proving more challenging than she'd expected. The outdoor industry contacts Derek had mentioned turned out to be casual acquaintances rather than professional connections, people who were friendly enough socially but not positioned to create employment opportunities for someone with Elena's background and qualifications. Elena's interviews with outdoor companies revealed the gap between her expectations and industry reality. Her tech marketing experience was viewed as irrelevant rather than transferable, her recent climbing enthusiasm seen as superficial rather than authentic, her association with Derek more of a liability than an asset in professional contexts where personal and business relationships were carefully separated. Companies that might have been interested in her marketing skills weren't convinced by her commitment to outdoor culture, while organizations that valued authentic outdoor experience weren't impressed by her professional qualifications. Elena found herself trapped between two worlds, too new to outdoor culture to be trusted by industry insiders but too identified with outdoor lifestyle to be taken seriously by mainstream marketing employers. The rejection letters Elena received weren't cruel, but they were definitively disappointing. Companies praised her enthusiasm and wished her well in her career exploration, but none offered the opportunities she'd envisioned. Elena was discovering that changing career required more than changing personal interests, that professional credibility couldn't be acquired through romantic association, that wanting something badly wasn't sufficient qualification for achieving it. Derek's response to Elena's mounting challenges revealed aspects of his character that romantic attraction had previously obscured. When Elena shared her disappointment about job rejections, Derek offered encouragement but no practical assistance. When she mentioned financial stress, he suggested she lower her expectations rather than providing support. When she expressed frustration about feeling unwelcome in his social circle, he defended his friends rather than addressing her concerns. Elena had expected Derek to be her partner in navigating these challenges, to provide guidance and support as she adjusted to fundamental life changes. Instead, Derek treated her difficulties as personal problems that she needed to resolve independently, challenges that weren't his responsibility to solve or even seriously consider. The man who'd been so attentive and helpful during climbing instruction became distant and unavailable when Elena needed emotional support rather than athletic coaching. Derek was comfortable teaching rope techniques and mountain navigation, but he was completely unprepared to help someone rebuild their entire life around his world and priorities. Elena began recognizing that Derek's appeal had been largely situational, tied to his role as instructor and guide rather than his qualities as a long-term partner. When she'd needed someone to teach her climbing, Derek had been Now that she needed someone to help her construct a sustainable life, Derek was revealing himself to be fundamentally unsuited for that kind of partnership. The romantic adventure Elena had chosen over stable marriage was proving to be exactly that, an adventure rather than a foundation, an exciting interlude rather than a viable alternative to the life she'd abandoned. Derek had never promised permanence or stability, had never suggested he was prepared to build something lasting with her. Elena had simply assumed that passion and compatibility were sufficient basis for fundamental life reconstruction. As autumn progressed and Elena's initial optimism gave way to practical concerns about her future, she began experiencing the first serious doubts about the choices she'd made. The climbing skills she'd developed were genuine accomplishments, but they weren't sufficient foundation for the life transformation she'd attempted. The passion she'd discovered was real, but it wasn't strong enough to overcome the practical challenges of building a sustainable existence around someone else's priorities and limitations. Elena was beginning to understand the difference between fantasy and reality, between romantic inspiration and practical partnership, between adventure and actual life. And she was starting to realize that the choice she'd made so confidently that Sunday morning in our kitchen might not have been the choice she'd thought she was making. Winter in Seattle arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of persistent rain that turns outdoor adventures into endurance tests rather than romantic escapes. Elena's climbing schedule, once filled with weekend expeditions to scenic overlooks, became confined to indoor gyms and artificial holds. The weather that had seemed charming during her autumn romance with Derek began revealing the practical limitations of building a life around outdoor activities in the Pacific Northwest. Derek's income, dependent on seasonal guide work and outdoor instruction, dropped significantly as clients canceled trips and postponed lessons. The financial pressure Elena had been feeling intensified as Derek's earning capacity diminished just as her own savings reached critically low levels. The shared expenses that had seemed manageable during climbing season became impossible burdens when neither partner had reliable income. Elena's job search, stalled throughout the fall, became desperate as winter expenses mounted. Storage unit fees, climbing gym memberships, gear payments and basic living costs were consuming her remaining resources while employment opportunities remained frustratingly elusive. The outdoor industry contacts Derek had promised turned out to be fair-weather friendships that disappeared when Elena needed actual professional assistance. By December, Elena was working part-time at an outdoor gear retail store in Capitol Hill, selling equipment to customers who reminded her of who she'd been 6 months earlier. Enthusiastic beginners, seeking advice about their first climbing shoes, weekend warriors investing in gear for adventures they might attempt once or twice before losing interest. Elena found herself recommending products with expertise she'd gained through expensive trial and error, watching people make the same optimistic purchases she'd once made. The irony wasn't lost on her. Elena had left a successful marketing career to pursue authentic outdoor lifestyle only to find herself working retail in the outdoor industry, selling gear to people who had the financial security to treat climbing as a hobby rather than a life-defining commitment. Her colleagues were younger climbers working seasonal jobs to fund their adventures, not professionals who'd abandoned careers for passion projects. Derek's response to Elena's employment situation revealed the final dimensions of his character that romantic infatuation had concealed. When Elena expressed frustration about her reduced circumstances, Derek suggested she'd been unrealistic about the financial requirements of outdoor lifestyle. When she mentioned feeling isolated from his social circle, Derek blamed her expectations rather than addressing the community dynamics that excluded newcomers. Most significantly, when Elena began questioning whether their relationship could survive the practical challenges they were facing, Derek treated her concerns as personal weakness rather than legitimate relationship issues requiring mutual problem-solving. The man who'd been so patient and encouraging during climbing instruction became dismissive and unavailable when Elena needed emotional support during her life transition. Elena realized that Derek had never viewed their relationship as a partnership requiring shared responsibility for challenges and solutions. He'd enjoyed her company during the exciting phases of her transformation but had no interest in helping her navigate the difficult consequences of choices he'd encouraged her to make. Derek had been a catalyst for Elena's life changes, not a partner committed to supporting the results of those changes. The climbing community Elena had hoped to join permanently began revealing its seasonal nature as winter weather reduced outdoor opportunities. The social connections she developed during active climbing months proved superficial when activities moved indoors and group dynamics shifted. Elena discovered that outdoor communities often fragment during off-seasons, with members pursuing individual interests until conditions improve for shared adventures. The women Elena had met through Derek's social circle became less available as weather limited climbing opportunities and people focused on indoor pursuits that didn't naturally include Elena. She'd been included in group activities when climbing provided obvious shared interests, but she lacked the deeper friendships necessary for maintaining social connections during inactive periods. Elena found herself increasingly isolated, spending long evenings in Derek's house while he pursued individual interests that didn't include her. The cramped quarters that had seemed cozy during romantic phases of their relationship became oppressive when daily routine revealed the limitations of space designed for one person's lifestyle. Elena was living in someone else's world without having successfully created a place for herself within it. The holiday season brought Elena's situation into sharp focus as she confronted the reality of spending Christmas in circumstances she could never have imagined 6 months earlier. The house in Queen Anne, where she'd hosted elegant dinner parties and sophisticated gatherings, belonged to someone else now. The social circle she'd cultivated during her marriage had moved on without her. The family traditions she'd established were continuing without her participation. Elena spent Christmas Day working at the retail store, selling gear to customers preparing for holiday ski trips and winter climbing expeditions. She watched families shopping together for outdoor adventures, parents investing in equipment for children's developing interests, couples planning shared experiences in mountain environments she'd once explored with optimistic enthusiasm. That evening, Derek attended a climbing community party without inviting Elena, explaining that it was primarily for longtime members and she might feel uncomfortable among people she didn't know well. Elena spent the night alone in Derek's house, surrounded by gear and photographs that documented adventures she'd never shared, experiences that belonged to Derek's life before her arrival. The isolation Elena felt that Christmas evening was profound in ways that extended beyond simple loneliness. She'd abandoned her previous life for what she'd believed was a better alternative, only to discover that the alternative wasn't actually available to her. She was neither part of Derek's established world nor welcome to return to the life she'd left behind. Derek's climbing party lasted until the early morning hours, and when he returned he was accompanied by several friends who decided to continue their celebration at his house. Elena, already asleep in the small bedroom, was awakened by voices and laughter from people who treated the space like it belonged entirely to Derek, which it did. Among the party guests was a woman Elena recognized from the climbing gym, someone Derek had mentioned as a promising new student who was progressing rapidly through basic techniques. She was younger than Elena, newer to climbing, and clearly fascinated by Derek's expertise and attention. Elena watched from the bedroom doorway as Derek demonstrated some advanced technique using furniture as anchors, the same patient instruction style that had first attracted Elena's interest. The woman listened with the same absorbed attention Elena remembered from her early lessons, asked questions with the same eager curiosity Elena had once displayed, responded to Derek's encouragement with the same grateful enthusiasm that had characterized Elena's initial interactions with him. Elena was witnessing the beginning of Derek's next instructional relationship, watching him deploy the same charm and expertise that had once seemed uniquely directed toward her. The pattern Elena observed that night confirmed what she'd been reluctantly recognizing for weeks. Derek's interest in her had been situational rather than personal, tied to his role as teacher and her position as eager student. Now that Elena had developed climbing competence and no longer needed basic instruction, Derek's attention was naturally shifting towards someone who could provide the satisfaction of starting fresh with fundamental techniques and grateful appreciation. Elena understood that she was watching her replacement being introduced to the community that had never quite accepted her as a permanent member. The young woman would follow the same progression Elena had experienced, receiving intensive attention and instruction, developing skills and confidence, becoming romantically attracted to her inspiring guide. Eventually she would face the same choice Elena had faced, between stability and adventure, between practical concerns and passionate inspiration. The difference was that this woman was younger, unattached, and financially independent. She wouldn't need to abandon a marriage or career to pursue outdoor lifestyle. She could integrate climbing into her existing life rather than reconstructing her entire identity around Derek's world and priorities. She was a more suitable candidate for the kind of relationship Derek actually preferred, someone who could share his interests without requiring him to support major life transitions. Elena spent the rest of that night awake, listening to conversations in the main room that confirmed her growing understanding of her situation. Derek's friends discussed her with casual indifference, referring to her as someone who tried to transition too quickly from suburban marriage to outdoor lifestyle. They weren't cruel, but they clearly viewed her as a temporary presence rather than a permanent addition to their community. Elena heard her own story discussed as a cautionary tale about the challenges of major life changes undertaken for romantic rather than practical reasons. The climbing community had observed Elena's trajectory with detached interest, recognizing patterns they'd seen before, predicting outcomes based on previous examples of similar transitions. Most devastating of all, Elena heard Derek participate in these conversations without defending her choices or expressing concern about her struggles. He discussed Elena's situation with the same analytical detachment his friends displayed, offering observations about her adjustment challenges without acknowledging his role in encouraging decisions that had led to her current difficulties. Derek had moved on emotionally before Elena realized their relationship was ending. While she'd been struggling to build a sustainable life around their shared interests, Derek had been preparing for the arrival of someone better suited to his lifestyle and preferences. Elena was discovering that she'd been living in the aftermath of a relationship that had already concluded, playing a role in someone else's life after her actual presence had become superfluous. The conversation Elena overheard that night included references to Derek's pattern of intense involvement with students followed by gradual distance as they developed independence. His friends discussed this dynamic with amused tolerance, treating Derek's instructional relationships as harmless entertainment rather than serious emotional entanglements. They understood that Derek's attention was valuable but temporary, meaningful but not permanent. Elena realized that the climbing community had been waiting for Derek's interest in her to fade, watching her situation with the patience of people who'd observed similar scenarios multiple times. They'd been polite and superficially welcoming while maintaining emotional distance because they knew Elena was unlikely to become a permanent member of their social circle. January brought Elena face to face with financial realities that could no longer be ignored or postponed. Her savings were exhausted, her retail income insufficient to cover basic expenses, and her storage unit fees adding financial pressure that served no practical purpose. The belongings she'd been maintaining in Ballard represented a previous life that no longer existed, items too expensive to discard but too impractical to use in her current circumstances. Elena's attempts to retrieve some financial stability through her professional network revealed how completely she'd severed connections to her previous career world. The marketing colleagues who might have provided employment references or job leads had moved on during her months of outdoor adventure. The industry contacts she'd cultivated had developed relationships with other professionals. Elena's absence from professional activities during her climbing obsession had effectively ended her career momentum in ways that couldn't be quickly reversed. Derek's suggestion that Elena consider returning to her estranged husband wasn't offered with concern for her well-being but with obvious relief at the possibility of resolving her dependency on his limited resources. Derek had never explicitly asked Elena to leave, but his encouragement for her to explore other options made his preferences clear. Elena was becoming an inconvenience that was interfering with his preferred lifestyle and emerging romantic interests. The phone call Elena had been avoiding since autumn became inevitable in late January when her financial situation reached crisis levels. She needed to contact Marcus about practical matters related to their separation, property division, and potential reconciliation. Elena had left their marriage believing she was moving toward better circumstances, but winter had demonstrated that her alternatives were neither sustainable nor satisfying. Elena's pride made the phone call to Marcus almost impossible to initiate. She'd declared her choice with such confidence, announced her departure with such certainty, dismissed his calm response with such superiority. Admitting that her adventure had failed meant acknowledging that Marcus had been right to remain composed rather than devastated by her announcement. When Elena finally called Marcus on a rainy Thursday evening in late January, she'd rehearsed various approaches for requesting a conversation about their relationship status. She'd prepared explanations about discovering that outdoor lifestyle wasn't as compatible with her long-term goals as she'd anticipated. She'd planned to frame her contact as mature recognition that their marriage deserved reconsideration rather than desperate retreat from failed alternatives. Marcus answered the phone with the same calm tone he'd maintained throughout their kitchen conversations 6 months earlier. He listened to Elena's carefully prepared opening remarks about wanting to discuss their future without interrupting or displaying emotion. When Elena finished her preliminary explanation, Marcus responded with characteristic directness that eliminated the possibility of diplomatic evasion. "Elena, I understand that your situation with Derek hasn't worked out as you expected. I'm willing to discuss the practical aspects of our separation, but I need you to understand that reconciliation isn't an option I'm considering. Too much has changed for both of us." Marcus's response contained no anger or satisfaction, just clear information about his position and priorities. Elena had expected either emotional warmth that would facilitate reconciliation or residual resentment that would provide motivation for winning him back. She hadn't anticipated calm indifference that suggested Marcus had genuinely moved beyond their relationship rather than simply waiting for her return. Elena learned during that conversation that Marcus had thrived during her absence in ways that made her return neither necessary nor particularly desirable. His architectural practice had expanded, his personal life had improved, and his social connections had developed beyond their shared history. Marcus had used Elena's departure as an opportunity for positive life changes rather than as a crisis requiring desperate solutions. Most significantly, Marcus had begun seeing someone else, a colleague from his architectural firm who shared his professional interests and appreciated his steady character. Elena realized that while she'd been struggling to build a new life with Derek, Marcus had been successfully building a better version of his existing life without her. Her absence had freed Marcus to pursue relationships and opportunities that were more compatible with his actual preferences and goals. The conversation Elena had initiated hoping to explore reconciliation possibilities became a negotiation about practical separation terms. Marcus was prepared to handle property division and financial arrangements with the same professional competence he brought to architectural projects. Elena's attempt to reconnect emotionally was treated as a separate issue that wouldn't influence the practical resolution of their legal relationship. Marcus's new relationship was serious enough that Elena's potential return would represent an unwelcome complication rather than a welcomed resolution. Elena discovered that she'd forfeited her position in Marcus's life permanently rather than temporarily, that choices made during romantic infatuation had consequences extending far beyond the duration of that infatuation. Elena's call to Marcus confirmed what she'd been reluctantly acknowledging for weeks. Her adventure with Derek had failed completely, leaving her financially depleted, professionally stalled, and personally isolated. But the life she'd abandoned was no longer available for reclamation. Elena had engineered her own exile from both her previous stability and her attempted alternative. The final conversation Elena had with Derek occurred in February during one of Seattle's brief sunny periods that reminded everyone why people tolerated the winter rain. Elena had been planning this discussion for weeks, trying to find an approach that would preserve some dignity while acknowledging that their relationship had run its natural course. Derek made the conversation easier by expressing relief that Elena was finally ready to admit what they'd both understood for months. Their relationship had been based on Elena's transition needs rather than compatible long-term goals. Derek had enjoyed supporting Elena's initial discovery of climbing, but he wasn't prepared to provide ongoing support for someone whose life circumstances required more stability than he could offer. Derek's honesty about his limitations and preferences was more respectful than Elena had expected. He acknowledged that their relationship had been meaningful while admitting that it wasn't sustainable given their different needs and circumstances. Derek hadn't intended to create false expectations about their future, but he hadn't discouraged Elena's assumptions about building something permanent together. Elena realized that Derek hadn't betrayed her so much as she'd betrayed herself by projecting long-term partnership potential onto someone who'd been clear about his priorities and limitations. Derek had never promised permanence or stability, had never suggested he was prepared to support someone else's major life changes, had never indicated interest in accommodating domestic partnership responsibilities. The climbing equipment Elena had accumulated during her months with Derek became symbols of her failed transition rather than useful tools for ongoing adventures. Elena sold most of her gear to cover immediate expenses, keeping only basic items that reminded her of genuine accomplishments rather than romantic illusions. The skills she'd developed were real and valuable, even if the relationship that had motivated their development hadn't provided lasting benefits. Elena's departure from Derek's house occurred with less drama than her departure from her marriage had involved. She packed her remaining belongings into her BMW, abandoned the storage unit in Ballard with relief rather than regret, and drove toward an uncertain future that at least belonged entirely to her rather than depending on someone else's charity or tolerance. Spring brought Elena a retail management position at an outdoor gear company in Portland, far enough from Seattle to represent a genuine fresh start but connected enough to outdoor industry to utilize the knowledge she'd gained during her climbing obsession. Elena's experience as both customer and employee in outdoor retail provided qualifications that mainstream marketing positions hadn't offered. Elena's new life in Portland was modest compared to the prosperity she'd enjoyed during her marriage or the adventures she'd pursued with Derek, but it was sustainable and independent. Elena had learned to build stability around her own capabilities rather than depending on relationships to provide either financial security or romantic excitement. The lessons Elena learned during her year of attempted adventure were costly but valuable. Elena discovered that passion without practical foundation leads to disappointment, that romantic inspiration isn't sufficient basis for major life decisions, that choosing adventure over stability requires personal resources that can't be borrowed from other people's enthusiasm or expertise. Elena also learned that authentic transformation takes longer than romantic infatuation suggests, that changing lives requires more than changing interests, that building new identity involves patient development rather than dramatic declarations. Elena's climbing skills remained genuine accomplishments, but they hadn't provided the complete life reconstruction she'd imagined they would offer. Marcus occasionally heard updates about Elena's situation through mutual acquaintances, but he felt neither satisfaction nor concern about her struggles and eventual stabilization. Elena's choices had been her own responsibility and her consequences belonged to her as well. Marcus had moved forward with his life without dwelling on Elena's alternative path or its outcomes. Elena's story became a cautionary tale in Seattle's climbing community, referenced when new students began displaying signs of confusing athletic instruction with romantic potential. Derek continued his pattern of intense involvement with promising students, but the community became more attentive to warning signs of students who might misinterpret professional attention as personal interest. The house in Queen Anne that Elena had abandoned for adventure continued to appreciate in value while providing Marcus with the peaceful domestic environment he'd always preferred. Marcus's new relationship developed into marriage built on shared professional interests and compatible life goals rather than romantic infatuation and dramatic gestures. Elena's choice to prioritize passion over stability had taught everyone involved valuable lessons about the difference between temporary excitement and lasting satisfaction, between romantic inspiration and practical partnership, between choosing someone and choosing wisely. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.